And welcome. Today we'll be talking about U.S. politics since 1920s, 1920-ish. And we'll be tying this, particularly, it'll feel like a history class much of the time, but we'll be tying it into Christian groups that we've been discussing over this past year and seeing how politics and Christianity and types of Christianity mix in America. So although there are many disagreements on issues and policies, in my opinion, at the heart of many differences between between Democrats and Republicans since 1920, the heart of it is that Democrats tend to focus or tend to support a larger government and more government involvement, while Republicans tend to focus and favor a smaller government, meaning less government involvement and regulation. So again, Democrats favor a big government, meaning in particular, we'll talk about the federal government. This refers to Washington, D.C., and how much Washington can say about each state's handling of different issues and how it handles money, how our tax system works, and different programs that seek to support different groups within our country. Should it be up to states and local people and non-political groups like churches to take care of these issues and people, or is it up to the federal government to solve the problems? For Democrats, it tends to be more of the federal government being involved, and for Republicans, it tends to be more support of state solutions, local solutions, and non-government solutions like churches, ministries, and different organizations. So let's see how this has played out since the 1920s and 30s. In the 1920s, you had what's called the Roaring Twenties, and there was a big stock increase, and the living status of much of our country improved during that time. And a lot of it perhaps was due to the non-regulation that Republican presidents favored. So Republicans favored less economic regulation. In other words, companies can decide what to do, and it's up to them to decide who they'll pay, how much they'll pay, what kind of working conditions they'll allow. And if people don't like it, they don't have to work there. And they can go work at a company that takes better care of them. And so this allowing the market to run its course and supply and demand, and people who take better care of their employees will get better employees that will take care of things itself. We don't need the government to run things or say what can or should be done. But then came the stock market crash of at the end of the 1920s, and the Great Depression, and unemployment was nationally about 25%, which is even more than it is right now in the midst of the quarantine. So imagine this kind of feeling where you can't go to work, but it's not because of a disease, it's because of there are no jobs. And in some areas it was up to 80 and 90% unemployment rate. And so Democrats began to favor government regulation of the economy. And so the federal government can decide rules that will help workers keep their jobs, that will restrict companies' abilities to not keep resources that would keep their company going, and to create various programs that would help people if for some reason they do lose their job or are in a state of poverty. And so the main president during this time, he was actually elected for 4 terms, although he died during his 4th term, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And here is a picture of him. And Roosevelt was a big supporter of the New Deal and other measures that helped put people to work. And so the government paid for up to 3 million people, or more than 3 million people, to work. And in fact, the town I grew up in Massachusetts, had a golf course that was built by the Public Works Association of this time. And actually, when I walk the streets of Riverside, or if you live in Riverside, notice the sidewalks will say that they were built by the WPA. And so the government paid to have sidewalks built, golf courses built, roads, bridges, buildings, anything that would get people working. The government paid for it and tried to get people to have income during the Great Depression. But more so, by the end of his 13-year presidency, the federal government expanded a lot more. Before, it was kind of there for kind of crisis situations, but now, ever since FDR, the federal government's been a very key part of everyday life for Americans. Again, it provided more than 3 million jobs during the Depression. That's a huge percent, especially given that our country's population was much smaller at that time than it is today. The federal government began to take money from people's income in order to fund Social Security, a national fund for the elderly. So once you hit a certain age, you can get money from that's you have put in there from your various paychecks for all your different jobs. The government began to protect and encourage workers to form unions. A union is a situation where employees act as one, and so rather than create competing contracts with different employees, everybody gets the same contract. This is most familiar with nurses and teachers, professional sports agencies, musicians, actors, car manufacturers, and many other types of work. They have unions, and this allows them, rather than compete against each other, like, ooh, I want to keep my job, so I'll be willing to take less pay, or I will try to show off so I can get a bigger raise and leave my counterparts in the dust. Rather, they all work as one, and they all are on the same system of pay and benefits. And the government began supporting this so that factory workers and others would not be taken advantage of or face these hardships posed by the factory owners and higher-ups in the company. Also, the federal government began mandating affordable housing opportunities and providing loans for those with lower incomes. If you've ever heard of Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac, those were created during FDR's presidency to help people buy homes. And if you look around towns like East Providence or Riverside or Warren or many other places, you'll see lots of these little homes, parts of Bristol on the Warren border that were built, little ranch homes and other smaller homes that were built to try to get people out of the tenements in the factory areas and allow them to live in their own house. And prior to this time, often homes would only be owned by those with a lot more money because it was hard to get loans and to pay for loans and to guarantee loans. And so older homes from the 1800s tend to be larger and these Victorian homes for the wealthy elite. And in the mid-20th century, you start seeing lots of ranch homes and smaller Cape-style homes and other homes that were meant to provide a home for everyone, not just the people who had a lot of extra income. So then federal programs also expanded in the 1960s and 70s under the Democratic presidencies of John F. Kennedy. He is America's only Catholic president. Here's a picture of Kennedy. And I was like his bright smile. He's a smiley guy. And Kennedy, again, is the only Catholic president in American history so far. He was elected in 1960. He was assassinated, and so many of his policies continued under Lyndon Johnson, and were then furthered in the 70s by President Jimmy Carter, a Baptist who was one of the few presidents in recent decades, perhaps the only one in the 20th century to identify as an evangelical Christian, a born-again evangelical Christian. And so it's important to see that these differences between Democrats and Republicans, when we look back in time, are not so much about social issues that perhaps get a lot of news coverage nowadays, but they're rather from just a basic economic perspective. Should the government do more to help working class and poorer Americans and regulate industries and taxes and funds and programs, or should the government stay smaller? So by the end of Kennedy's presidency and Johnson's and Carter's, here are some more examples of programs that were passed to help working class and poorer Americans. So Medicaid and Medicare were passed. Those are government-funded health care insurances. There's SNAP, that's a government-funded program to provide food and other basic necessities to people in need. And the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, and that outlaws discrimination based on race, nationality, gender, etc. It also featured follow-up programs to make sure it was enforced, such as laws regulating busing to schools to make sure that all can get there. And so these weren't just one-time laws that were passed. Here's the signing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. These were bills that were just the start of many other smaller, lesser-known bills that supported equal opportunities and equal rights and government programs and policies to help those who faced hardship, whether economic or racial or whatnot. These programs come at a great price. In fact, today, about half of our budget, over $2 trillion every year, goes to pay for Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And these funds, unfortunately, are not always being supplemented, and so we take out loans as a country. And as a younger working person, I get I get a letter every so often from the Social Security office saying that hopefully by the time I retire, I will get 75 cents for every dollar I put in, meaning that every one of my paychecks has money taken out, and I should get 75% of it back by the time I'm 70 and I'm allowed to take Social Security. Now, that kind of difference, if I told you every day you have to give me $1, but I only give you 75 cents back many years from now for every dollar you give me, you may be hesitant. Why would you want to lose a quarter every day? And it's because of policies and concern about the debt in America and infringing on people's freedoms. Why should I have to lose my money when I care about the poor, but I'd rather give it to my church or a ministry that takes care of the poor? Why should I have to have the government take care of my money and spend it as the government pleases? I trust myself and I don't trust the government, and I think they'll waste the money. That's the attitude of many Republicans during these decades I'm talking about. And so Republicans were not necessarily against helping the poor, but they were against having the government take on more and more of that role. So they wanted a smaller federal government. meaning less regulation and more state and local control. And they also wanted less taxes. Again, people should be able to choose where they want to donate their money rather than write a blank check to the government. Not that they actually write that check, but the government just takes out money in taxes and other means. So how did Christians respond to these situations? Well, the Catholics were by far in favor of the Democratic Party during these decades and its ideology. Ideology means its political views. Again, in this case, the idea that there should be a strong federal government to oversee issues regarding economics and civil rights and other such things. So ideology is kind of a view of politics. It can mean other things as well. For our purposes, we'll stick with politics. As many had immigrated from the U.S. in the 1910s and 20s and 30s and were lower income factory workers in cities across the U.S. And so these Catholics, again, they found that the Democratic Party helped them by supporting their unions as well as providing programs for them to buy homes and to get help if they found themselves unemployed or struggling economically. The Black Church also was a major supporter of the Democratic Party and its ideology, as it was their ticket to civil rights, equal employment opportunities, programs to reduce the sting of poverty that many felt. And so whether they were rural poor in the South or urban poor in northern cities, many in the Black Church found the Democratic Party to be their ticket to the American dream and to equality. Among non-Black Protestants, there was often a split on socioeconomic status. Working class and poorer families tended to support democratic ideals as it helped their unions and protected them from severe hardship. But middle and wealthy class Protestants tended to support the Republican ideology as they felt they had worked hard for their money and it was not the government's job to take it without their consent. And so, again, please realize that in the decades past, the divide between Democrats and Republicans was much more about economics and about policies. What role should the government play in supporting people and in regulating businesses? I remember my grandfather growing up always, although he was a very conservative Christian, he was always very loyal to the Democratic Party because he said the Republicans only care about the rich person. They don't care about the little people. So things have changed in recent years, and we're going to see these cultural changes as we continue our notes. So once again, the decade that featured a lot of these changes were the 1960s. And starting in the 1960s, you get this postmodern emphasis that we talked about in Lesson 2 that respects and appreciates diverse experiences, viewpoints, and values of every individual. Again, the idea is that no one has all the truth, but everyone has some, and everyone deserves to be heard. This idea of relativism that we saw begins to influence politics. And so in 1962, prayer was outlawed in schools. Just 58 years ago, it was the common practice that every day after announcements, everyone would recite the Lord's Prayer, the Protestant version of the Lord's Prayer in schools. And this also was declared unconstitutional as it was not respecting the views of non-Protestants and non-Christians, especially atheists or Jews in public schools. And so in 1962, it was outlawed to have any mandatory prayer. Abortion was legalized in 1973, and again, this was a big change as it allowed women to decide if they will terminate the pregnancy and abort the fetus that is in them, and whether to view this as a child who deserves life or whether to view it as a burden that they have the duty to be responsible and not allow to infringe upon their life or upon the society as a whole. Views of sex and gender also began to change with the 1960s sexual revolution. If you ever see anything with the hippies talking about free love and creating a much more accepting culture of sex outside of marriage, and later on homosexuality, and just a changing idea of what family life is, and sex is. And so sex education began being taught in schools. Birth control became more widely available. Many public schools, perhaps all, have condoms available from the nurse that people can get that are paid for by tax-paying Americans. And so, again, this raises questions. Should taxpayers have to support buying someone else's condom? Or is that infringing on the rights of the worker to decide where their money goes and enabling irresponsible behavior, encouraging irresponsible behavior? The roles of women began to change in society with the feminist movement in the 1970s, and in the early 2000s, the same-sex marriage and transgender issues that you probably are all familiar with have also become highly politicized. So things began to change starting in the 60s, and where traditionally differences were just economic-based, big government regulation, not big government regulation. Now you have a lot more of these moral, political, religious issues impacting American politics. To combat what they viewed as in America's turn against God, Jerry Falwell and others began developing what's called the religious right. Jerry Falwell, perhaps you've heard of him, or at least his most famous achievement was the founding of Liberty University. He was a Baptist pastor, and he began to muster support from conservative and fundamentalist Christians to create what is frequently called the religious right. Meaning conservative or against liberal and secular changes in society. That's what the word right here means. And so perhaps, at least in my experience, many of BCA are familiar with these kinds of views. The religious right tends to be against abortion, and sometimes that's the biggest concern. It tends to be against euthanasia. Euthanasia is doctor-assisted suicide. It tends to be against homosexuality, and particularly legal equality for same-sex marriages or same-sex families, or various subliminal ways that homosexuality is promoted as normal or a normal alternative. Sex education in schools, they tend to focus on saying it's the parents' job, it's the church's job to educate people on issues related to sex, not a school's job. Also, teaching evolution in schools without also teaching what the Bible says about a 6-day creation. And interestingly, although before Republicans had been against a strong church and state connection, the religious right tends to want America to vote Christian in a more kind of Christendom view. So they'll often be against the kind of separation of church and state that causes more secularism. So they might want the government to support churches in some kind of official manner, but they're against the secular separation of church and state, where anything religious also becomes outlawed. Some things that the religious right are often for include Israel, and so you'll sometimes hear about Republican or Christian movements to try to support Israel, even if Israel is harming Christians in its country by its policies of taking land. Much of that has to do with their views of the end times and that Israel will become a country and become Christian. They often are, again, for prayer in schools and trying to bring that back in various ways. I remember watching a documentary about a Mississippi football team that was done just a couple years ago, and they said the Lord's Prayer before a game. I don't think that would fly up here in the north, but in Mississippi, that was A-OK. So these are kind of a summary of what the religious right is typically against or for. And since, again, much of the social change was supported by the Democratic Party, was supported by the Democratic Party, the religious right became associated with the Republican Party. And this has to do, this difference, the reason why the Democratic Party became the supporter of many of these changes, there's several reasons, but one of them has to do with the idea of the federal government protecting and establishing civil rights of every individual. In other words, to not have sex education schools denies all children the right to hear of a scientific and education-based explanation of human sexuality and of their own bodies, and is a harm to them to not protect the rights of to allow abortion. Even many politicians have said they're against abortion, but they wouldn't want to end the right to it because it's not their job to say what a woman should have to do with her body. That's why people who are in favor of legalizing abortion don't call themselves pro-abortion. Nobody wants abortions, or hopefully not, but they want to be pro-choice. You'll hear that term because they want women to be allowed to choose, not to be forced to have children and take responsibility for them when men often don't have that burden if there's an unwanted pregnancy. Likewise, they tend to support the civil rights of people in situations that are seeking euthanasia. It's not that they want people to die or to voluntarily have a doctor kill them, but they want to protect their rights to end their life with dignity. And so on. In the Republican Party, again, these are seen as sins, and it doesn't matter if somebody chooses them. We shouldn't be allowing people to choose what's wrong. So again, the religious right became strong supporters of the Republican Party. And this creation of the religious right had far-reaching consequences and really, in many ways, set up much of what our political map looks like today if you ever follow presidential elections and how different states vote. Many Christians and the states they vote in, they may have previously supported Democratic policies for economic reasons. So perhaps coal miners in West Virginia felt that Democratic policies were in their favor and helping them as they worked in these hazardous conditions. But over time, they began switching to the Republican Party for moral reasons because they were against the abortion and the homosexuality and other issues, and they wanted a more to keep a more religious sense of America that had at least unofficially been present since its founding. And so this really changes the map, and some states that tended to be more Democratic became more Republican. In time, Catholics also began to split between those who supported the traditional equal opportunity and welfare policies of the Democratic Party and Catholics who felt they were compromising their views on marriage, sexuality, and abortion by staying Democrats. And so you have, in recent decades, a lot more Republican Catholics than you would have had 50 years ago. Beginning with the election of the Republican Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, 1980 and 84, the tone of American politics changed in many ways as the moral issues were more at stake, resulting in a widening polarization in politics. And so if you feel like our country is more divided today, it is. And partly because the issues now are much more than should the government be involved in politics. It's now, should the government decide what gender is and what a family is, what a life is. Those are huge, really profound questions that have caused our country to become much more divided than it was 50 or 70 or 100 years ago. Democrats have tended to become more progressive or radical, depending on your definition of progress, and Republicans have tended to become more conservative or fundamentalist, depending on your definition of beliefs and what is good and what is just too rigid. So where do things stand today then in terms of different Christian groups and American politics? Well, modern liberal white Protestants tend to support the Democratic Party. As they too value individual freedom to find one's true self. If you remember talking about modern existential theology, and also the Democratic view of supporting the poor and the oppressed in strong and binding ways, which again is akin to liberation theology and this idea that the church must stand up against oppressors. Conservative and fundamentalist white Protestants tend to support the Republican Party as they view the social changes as sinful and do not want the government to limit their rights to express their religious views. And so there have been movements that try to encourage ways that, although they can't outlaw abortion, but maybe make it more difficult or may give women more opportunities to think about what they're doing by exposing them to ultrasounds or whatnot before they can have an abortion. Or the incident where a cake maker in Colorado went to the Supreme Court because he didn't want to make a wedding cake for a gay couple that was seeking marriage in that state. Should he be allowed to express his religious views and say, I don't believe that's marriage and I'm not going to make that cake? Or should he be forced to serve these customers because they are people and allowed to have the right to marry in this country? Catholics tend to be split. And so wealthy and are more conservative Catholics tend to support Republicans, while working class and poorer or liberal Catholics tend to support Democrats. And so in our country we have lots of members of Congress are Catholics in both parties, and again they're split often over whether they believe that their faith more so supports the equality of people and the freedom that people have, whether of how to live. And although, as Vice Presidential candidate Kane said, he is a strong believer in pro-life, but he doesn't believe it's his job to force others to have this view. And so he supports pro-choice, not because he wants people to choose abortion, but because he recognizes that not everyone has his beliefs, and he wants to respect that and do what he can to support life in other ways. Although the majority of black churches and denominations would disagree with the social changes that have occurred in the U.S. regarding abortion, same-sex marriage, etc., the vast majority, over 90%, still continue to support the Democratic Party, as it has continued to be the political party that more strongly supports the civil rights and government policies and programs that have benefited them. Further changes have emerged since 2016 as President Trump has reintroduced nativist policies. Again, nativist policies mean anti-immigrant policies. To the Republican Party, although the vast majority of conservatives condemn his secular lifestyle and his strict immigration policies, the vast majority has still voted for him, as he has promised to support their religious right agenda. And so in this picture of photos, you can see a picture of the religious right, as sometimes it's characterized, again, connecting the cross with politics. Here's an image I thought was helpful in seeing the rise of Trump from the traditional anti-big government view of Republicans to tying in the religious right anti-abortion view, and then adding this anti-immigration nativism and all these different views coming together to support Trump despite some of the obstacles he would have otherwise faced perhaps in earlier generations. And here's a picture again of his nativist policy of finishing the wall, or of creating bans on people coming from various countries that are predominantly Muslim. There's been various also enforcing immigration policies much more strictly and creating more barriers for people to come into our country seeking asylum. There have been several nativist policies. And so this is where American politics are today. And as you think about where you fit into religious groups, also think about how politics maybe affect which groups you support or don't support, and why. Thank you.